Over the past few months, you guys heard a lot about the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. You heard about Hezbollah in Lebanon. You heard about Hamas in Gaza. You heard about the Syrian and the Iraqi militia. But we all know that these are not independent organizations. These are just proxies of Iran. The head of the snake is Iran. They're operated, funded, and completely controlled by Iran. So the reason that I'm making this video is to answer one simple question. Not what is the symptom, but rather what is the disease? Why does Iran so adamantly want to destroy the state of Israel that it's willing to take over whole countries, finance terrorist organizations, and invest decades into this master plan of ring of fire around Israel? Now, the answer to this question is a little bit more complex than you would think. So I ask of your patience just for a little bit. I have to explain to you what is the origin story here. The biggest fear of Iran, or rather the Iranian regime, was and still is that the United States will come in, take over, and westernize Iran and the rest of the Arab world, starting, of course, with Iran as its Islamic leader, the way they perceive themselves. They think that the United States has an agenda to westernize, take over the entire Arab world. And they know that if that happens, Iran is going to be the first in that order. Now, you can say a lot about the Iranian regime, but they're not stupid. In fact, they're very good at history, and they're looking at what happened with the USSR. Now, as you remember, up until 1990, the USSR was a strong adversarial force culturally to the US. And there were a culture war going on between these two superpowers for many, many decades. And then the United States made sure that the USSR fell apart like a cheap cushion at the seams. And that's why the Iranian regime behaves the way it behaves. For example, they overreact to any act of defiance, to any act of internal criticism. They clean house every few years to make sure there's no opposition that's even remotely possible to happen. They have complete media control. And they also prevent any sort of US intervention like it had in Ukraine. No color revolution, no Arab Spring. Iran is completely bulletproof to all of these US foreign interventions. We're not going to have Boris Yeltsin riding in on tanks to our capital. None of this. Not going to happen. And for that, they devised a plan. Number one, to completely overreact to any act of criticism or defiance from within. Number two, they completely control the media. And of course, they prevent any sort of US intervention in Iran. Anything that resembles potentially indirect US influence gets eliminated right away. And for Iran, the operating arm, long-distance arm robot of the US is Israel. That's how they perceive it. They see Israel as the outpost of the United States in the Middle East, designed to carry out the anti-Arab operations of the US against the Arab world and against Iran. And that's why, despite the theological rhetoric about the Jews and about the oppressiveness of the Israelis, the anti-Israeli sentiment in Iran and the anti-Israel activity of the Iranian regime of the past few years has nothing to do with Israel. It's all about the US. From their perspective, the US put up an outpost in their neighborhood to try and destroy them. They're going to take out that outpost. And the Israelis, they're basically stuck in the middle. And that's why about 20 years ago, the Iranian regime devised a plan on how to destroy Israel, to create that ring of fire, politically, strategically. Now, number one, they needed to absolutely flip the narrative. Post-World War II, the Jews were perceived as a victim of the Holocaust. They needed to change them. They needed to make the Jews the enemy, the colonizers, not the victim post the Holocaust, the aggressor. That is something they took from the KGB, by the way. That's a playbook that was written and absolutely perfected by the KGB. And they're just using it. And the second part is more of the same, but towards the US. Create a Nazi-like hatred towards the US. Make them out to be these evil colonizers that hate the world. Make people absolutely hate the US with a vengeance. And on top of it, make sure that inside the US, you convince half the people that their government is working against them. So you create tensions inside the US to potentially crumble it from inside. But here's the thing, turning the world against the Jews, turning the world against the US, and potentially turning half of America against itself to a potential civil war kind of situation, that's half the plan. The second plan is all about expansion. This second half has more to do with Iranian origins of understanding than anything else. You see, in Iranians' eyes, at least in the Iranian regime, the current state of Iran sits on about 30% of what the original Iran should have been in their mind, originally, historically. So for them, that expansion is just to bring back the stuff they lost over the years. And that's why you're seeing Iran take over whole countries, not officially, but for example, Lebanon is now completely controlled by Iran. Syria, completely controlled by Iran. Iraq, completely controlled by Iran. Yemen, completely controlled by Iran. Jordan in the process of being taken over by Iran. The reason that Iran is taking over all of these countries through proxy organizations is because they're expanding. In their mind, it's theirs. And in their mind, that expansion, that strategic depth is going to allow them to fend off the US and prevent the US from doing any shenanigans against Iran. If they have such a large strategic depth, the US is going to have a hard time toppling that regime. That's the whole setup. And if we go back to Israel, the solution as far as the Iranian goes is very, very simple. Let's use the Palestinians as a trigger to end the Israelis. Let's use Hezbollah. Let's use the Syrian militia. Let's use the Jordanian militia, which we'll have there after we topple that regime, and the Houthi rebels and Hamas, and potentially the West Bank, to close on Israel from within to create this strategic army military ring of fire around Israel in a way that doesn't allow them to do anything but collapse inwards. The whole idea is political isolation, US political isolation, internal divide in the US, expansion of Iran, and collapse strategically of Israel into itself slowly but surely. And that's what you're seeing right now on the ground. And actually, the Iranian regime views this whole thing as a massive, multi-year, multi-decade game of chess in which they are the king. In their mind, the king doesn't move. They move the peons, they move the rooks. The king stays put. That's the whole idea here. Use these proxies to make it happen. We don't move. What we have right now, as far as the US pushing the idea of a two-state solution, negotiation, a Palestinian state to make this whole thing stop, it's playing right into Iranian hands. And you see, the whole idea of a Palestinian state, it's basically not even an Iranian playbook. This thing was created back in the 60s by the KGB in the USSR. And the idea was very simple. The KGB had this idea where the Palestinian problem creates such chaos that the world of nations give them a piece of Israel in order for them to keep quiet. That piece of land will be funded and trained and operated by the KGB to basically create a terror state, which will eventually attack Israel on the proper date that they would like it to happen. And obviously, since then, the KGB is no longer with us, neither does the USSR, but the Iranians picked up the playbook and they're like, that's a pretty good idea. Let's do it. So they've basically been making the Palestinian problem so much worse. In fact, creating October 7th with the hopes that the Western logic of Europe and the US will lead them to appease the angry Palestinians by giving them a state, and by that solving the problem, not understanding where the source of this is coming from. Now, the idea is very simple. Let's get the Palestinians a state, then we can fund them, train them, supply them, eventually make them 100 times stronger than Hamas, and do the October 7th all over again, much more intensely, until we get them to collapse. Very, very simple. And so far, the Iranian plan is moving right along, when it would be so easy to prevent. The only thing you have to do is have some brain. You see, Ali Khamenei, the spiritual leader of Iran, he's a rational player. His main concern is losing his rule, losing the power. Every time in the past few decades, when the US actually challenged Iran for real, not by words, Iran backed off. Go Google it. Go check me on this. Instead of appeasing Iran and giving it what it wants to buy some quiet, the US needed to step up and stop this. Instead of appeasing Iran, instead of playing nice, all the US needs to do is show the Iranians they are willing to stand up and actually get them to pay for what they're doing. And they mean it. As soon as the Iranian regime understands that the US isn't just bluffing, they actually are willing to go and get it done, they'll back off. They have every time in the past for decades. However, whether it be politics, short-term election, or any sort of lack of understanding of the Middle East, the United States is clearly engaged in doing the opposite of what they need to do to get Iran to back off. This whole Middle East crisis can be stopped tomorrow if Iran understands that their regime is in risk. And yet the US is basically busy in looking weak, losing deterrence, and appeasing the neighborhood bully.